This is a CBS News special report. From Washington, the funeral of Dwight David Eisenhower.
This is Walter Cronkite reporting from Washington. Over 40,000 friends of Dwight David Eisenhower have passed the bier in the National Capitol, in the rotunda there of the Capitol building, up to this moment. The rotunda is now closed to the general public to allow for close friends and relatives a private moment in the presence of the flag-draped casket. The procession through the Capitol began yesterday afternoon and continued through yesterday's drizzle and into today's bright but chilly 44-degree weather. In less than half an hour from now, the casket will be returned to National Cathedral for official funeral ceremonies before the final train trip that begins this evening to Abilene, Kansas. The casket was placed in the rotunda yesterday afternoon, and since then the procession has been a steady one there. We have recorded the visit to the rotunda by some of the notables since yesterday, and here is that videotape. This was President Charles de Gaulle's visit to the rotunda and the casket. Shortly after he arrived in Washington yesterday evening from France, having come directly on a special Air France Boeing 707, salutes his old comrade-in-arms from World War II. This is Prime Minister John Gorton coming in now, Prime Minister of Australia. Prime Minister Gorton had planned a trip here later this week, official visit. He will not conduct that visit to Mr. Nixon now, although he will visit the State Department tomorrow. He'll come back later. And this is Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky of the Republic of South Vietnam. General Ky was was head of the Air Force in his country until he became president and then later vice president. Had kind words for the former president, the late President Eisenhower, saying that all of South Vietnam grieved for him. And our neighbor to the north, the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau. He had been here in Washington on a state visit just before the death of President Eisenhower and has now returned. This is Kurt George Kiesinger, the Chancellor of West Germany. The conquered nation of Germany has been most warm in the messages it has sent to Washington, to the Eisenhower family, and to President Nixon on the death of Dwight Eisenhower, the man who forced Germany's defeat in World War II. This is King Constantine of Greece, the exiled king who has been living in Rome for almost 2 years now, since a military coup in his country. This is President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, and Mrs. Marcos. There are crowned heads or heads of state or heads of government, a total of 26 nations here, and some 76 nations represented by other lesser officials on behalf of the heads of their governments. Many governors here, too, and political leaders from around the nation, as well as, of course, many military men, many of the general's followers from World War II days. This is Governor Reagan of California and his wife, Mrs. Reagan, and Senator George Murphy of California over there on the right. There is some disturbing news today, other than, of course, that of the funeral itself. We have just learned that Dr. Milton Eisenhower, the youngest brother of General Eisenhower, collapsed at a Washington hotel today and has been taken to Walter Reed Army Hospital. There is no immediate word on the nature of his illness. He was taken to the hospital by military ambulance. It was, of course, at Walter Reed where his brother died on Friday. They were particularly close, probably the closest of the Eisenhower brothers, although Dr. Eisenhower was the youngest at 68, 10 years younger than the deceased president. He had been the president of Johns Hopkins University and is the president emeritus of that distinguished institution. In 1930, when Dwight Eisenhower was a major attached to the office of the Army Chief of Staff, Milton was working in the government here in Washington and was an informal advisor to his brother throughout his presidency and later. They were on the phone almost daily on some sort of business or another, and now we learn that Dr. Milton Eisenhower is at Walter Reed, and we have no information on his condition or the nature of his illness. The funeral services this afternoon in another hour at the Washington Cathedral. Roger Mudd is up there on Capitol Hill, has been watching that long, never-ceasing parade of friends passing the casket in the main rotunda. Roger?
Walter, most of the activity here at the East Plaza of the Capitol is logistical. The cars of the funeral procession are now being put in order that they will leave the rotunda back to the cathedral.
Bring in Roger
procession.
He is there. However, on the plaza, across from the east portico of the Capitol building, this crowd waiting to watch the removal of the casket from the rotunda. Down the long flight of stairs again, we watched the climb yesterday as the pallbearers bore it into the rotunda. Back down those stairs to a waiting motorcade. There will be this afternoon no more caissons, no more marching men. That was yesterday as the cortege wound its way up Constitution Avenue and the Capitol Hill to the Capitol itself. Today, a motorcade will move at a rather rapid clip through the streets of Washington back to the National Cathedral. And then after the state funeral services there, again at a fairly good clip, down to the Union Station, where around 6 o'clock or 6:30 this evening, the train will depart to take the remains of General Dwight David Eisenhower to his hometown of Abilene, Kansas, for burial on Wednesday. Dan Rather is at the National Cathedral. Dan?
Walter, as the poets would say, the hounds of spring are out here this afternoon, whereas for the first day that President Eisenhower's body was here at the National Cathedral, we had a fairly warm day and some sunshine. Then on the second day, it snowed and intermittent rain. This was yesterday as President Eisenhower's body left the National Cathedral grounds. This afternoon, there's considerable wind, a chill in the air. The temperature is around 50 degrees, but the sun is out, a few squirrels are out, a few birds are out, and the largest crowd that I think we've had thus far at the cathedral at any one time is beginning to build here. This is the north entrance of Washington's National Cathedral, not the entrance from which President Eisenhower's body left, not the entrance to the small Bethlehem Chapel where his body was in repose Saturday and some of Sunday. This is the north entrance of the 14th century style Gothic architecture cathedral. And around this front entrance, the public is allowed within about 50 yards of the main entrance. And the crowd at the moment, we would guess to be in the neighborhood of 4,000 or 5,000 people, and building steadily. The security is stronger out here this afternoon than it has been at any other time since the death of General Eisenhower. Security was fairly strict on both Saturday and Sunday, but nothing like today. There are military police, soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, District of Columbia police, plainclothes officers, and Secret Service men literally everywhere. The obvious reason for the extra security laid on today is, of course, not only the fact that the President and the Vice President of the United States, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Justices of the Supreme Court, and all of the major figures of the United States government will be here, but the fact that so many heads of government and crowned heads from foreign countries will be here this afternoon. For example, just to get onto the grounds, Walter, to give you an idea, there are no fewer than 5 official press badges, all of which I have in my hand here. Perhaps we could get a shot of that. I don't know. Perhaps not. Nonetheless, we have 5 different press credentials that are necessary to get where we are, which is about 3/4 of the distance of a football field from the front entrance to the main grounds. The sun is just about to go down behind the still wintry trees here on the top of this hill, which we've mentioned earlier, I believe, is the highest point in the District of Columbia, Mount St. Albans, on which the cathedral is located. And once the sun gets down below those trees, which it will be by the time the funeral cortege reaches the National Cathedral for this, the final funeral service for President Eisenhower here in Washington, it will be even chillier than it is now. And as I mentioned, it isn't a bad afternoon here now at the moment at all, since the sun is out and it's fairly warm. But once the sun gets down, it'll be fairly cold, and that may cut into the crowd just a bit. But I would guess not, in that many of these people here, of course, come to mourn President Eisenhower, but one would be less than candid if he didn't point out that many of them also are here to celebrity watch, considering the fact that French President de Gaulle, the King of Belgium, Lord Mountbatten, and so many other world figures will be here. Many of these people have come simply to see those dignitaries, and the chill that we expect later on this evening, before General Eisenhower's body leaves the National Cathedral grounds for Union Station and that long trade line back to Abilene, I suspect that the crowd will grow larger and not smaller. Walter?
This, of course, has been a trying day already for Mrs. Eisenhower at her suite in the local hotel where she is staying, the Washington Hilton, the Mount Vernon suite there. There have been a constant parade of visitors to express their condolences. Mary Jean Eisenhower, the late general's granddaughter, was 13, told newsmen that she's doing very well, she said. She's a very strong lady. I'm very proud of her. Mrs. Eisenhower did have a visit early today, too, from recent President Lyndon Baines Johnson and Mrs. Johnson. They arrived almost secretly in Washington earlier today, took up residence in another hotel here. He said he would make no public appearances of any kind except to attend the funeral this afternoon because he did not wish to in any way upset the decorum, as he put it, of the services for General Eisenhower, and attracting attention to himself. Mr. Johnson was invited to the reception that President Nixon is going to hold later today, beginning at 7 o'clock, for the many foreign dignitaries here, but he will not attend that and will return directly to Austin, Texas, after the services this afternoon. He himself has received some friends at the Sheridan Park Hotel this afternoon, principal among them, Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, who he fought hard to get named as the Chief Justice, and as you recall, failed. With Mrs. Eisenhower, she has not only been receiving a procession of visitors with John Eisenhower, their only son, greeting them outside the suite and then ushering the chosen ones in to see his mother, but also they have been inundated with messages of condolences, we have been told, and despite the request of the family not for flowers, a great number have arrived there at the suite itself, many more at the Capitol and also up at the National Cathedral. Now let's go to Roger Mudd at the Capitol.
Walter, most of the activity here in the last hour has been logistical. The arrangement in the proper order of the processional cars, the military district of Washington, the Old Guard, that's the 3rd Infantry, 1st Battalion, has been busy arranging cars. As they pull up, they make the checklist and put them in the proper order so that when the casket is brought out of the rotunda, the processional can move off quickly. The doors to the main rotunda were closed this afternoon at 2:30, which was an extension of an hour, originally scheduled to close at 1:30. At about noon, the count, the nose count, was 40,000. The Capitol Police say between noon and 2:30, another 5,000 to 6,000 came through, so that your total here from yesterday afternoon until 2:30 today approached 45,000. The crowd, according to the Capitol Police, is mainly a tourist crowd. One of the captains who has been on duty here for the past 22 years, been on the police force for 22 years, called it a tourist crowd. No one prostrating himself, no nuts, as the police call it, just orderly people, many of them in Washington, which always draws a large tourist crowd as the season approaches cherry blossom and Easter time. By 11 o'clock this morning, the line waiting to go into the rotunda was 4 abreast, the equivalent of about 6 blocks long. This is a decision day at the Supreme Court, and the court met as scheduled at noon. The Chief Justice, Earl Warren, read to the court the statement he had issued on Friday, referring to the late General Eisenhower as a great man of the century, a civilian statesman. And then after a moment or two, the court adjourned until tomorrow, which will be its regular decision day. The Congress was in today, both House and Senate. They were in longer than the court. Both houses, chambers were in for about an hour and a half or 2 hours, and the session was made up, as you might expect, of eulogies from both sides of the aisle. The House has appointed Congressman Chester Mize, whose district includes Abilene, Kansas, and Congressman O.C. Fisher of Texas, a long-time friend of General Eisenhower's, to represent the House at the funeral in Abilene on Wednesday. The Senate has appointed the 2 Republican senators from Kansas, James Pearson and Robert Dole, to represent the Senate at those ceremonies. The Congress has then adjourned. They'll come back tomorrow briefly, then again Thursday briefly, and will go out for their Easter holiday until the 14th of April. The joint military cordon is now in place on the great steps leading up to the rotunda. That's the unit that we all watched in the cold yesterday. 61 men from the 5 services, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Army. Yesterday, the Army led the column in. Today, the Coast Guard led, and they alternate by a branch of service up the steps and fanning out into an L at the bottom. French President Charles de Gaulle is now arriving at the cathedral. He was, of course, here at the Capitol last night, and this morning conferred with President Nixon. Most of the heads of state, of course, will go directly to the cathedral rather than to the Capitol building here. The rotunda was closed off at 2:30, anticipation of Mrs. Eisenhower's arrival here. The joint military cordon is now in place, and over to the south side of the main Capitol steps is the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard band, which will play the military honors today and the hymns. Yesterday it was the U.S. Army band called Pershing's Own. Generally, the crowd, after its experience yesterday, is today well prepared for this weather. The temperature is not much higher here, but we are blessed with sunshine. And fortunately, the sun is not yet behind the rotunda, which means that everybody here on the east side of the Capitol is enjoying the direct rays of the sun, which pleases everyone after yesterday's experience. Most people who came down here yesterday have probably heard the weather forecast of 42 degrees going up to the middle 50s, and they took the weatherman at his word. But they learned better.
Roger?
Yes, Walter.
Thank you. We'll be back to you
All
very
right.
shortly now, of course, as they begin to remove the casket from the rotunda. We would like to go up now to the National Cathedral, where Dan Rather is standing by and can describe for us the scene inside there as the dignitaries are beginning to arrive. And we saw President de Gaulle arrive just a moment ago and be greeted as he took his place by the Shah of Iran. And he's sitting right in front of Manlio Brosio, the head of NATO. Come in, Dan.
Walter, General de Gaulle, of course, as you might expect, caused a great stir of excitement among the crowd of 4,000 or 5,000 on the outside of the National Cathedral. Now he is, as you have pointed out, seated inside the main portion of the cathedral. Entrance to the service inside is by invitation only. Some 2,107 people, including President Nixon, President de Gaulle, and 17 other heads of state, are included among those invited. This is the main cathedral hall where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King delivered one of his last sermons 1 year ago today here at the National Cathedral. This is where the casket will be placed once it arrives here from the Capitol Rotunda. A special service here at the cathedral commemorating the Interfaith Memorial Service at which the Dr. Martin Luther King spoke here at the cathedral was held yesterday, just after President Eisenhower's body left. More of the special invited guests, all of them being led up the triple staircase. The staircase is not a high one, but it's a winding one, which leads into the cathedral. Once inside the cathedral, each party is escorted to its seats by a representative of the armed forces. The National Cathedral was conceived during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison in the late 19th century. Construction was actually started in the early 20th century. President Theodore Roosevelt laid the original cornerstone.
Dan?
Yes, Walter.
I have here, I thought you might like to see it, our public out there, the invitation to the services there at the cathedral. 2,000 of these, 2018 I think exactly, were issued. Telegrams were sent across the country to those who the family thought would like to attend the services. These are the personal friends rather than the official friends, of course. And actually, they admit that more were invited than the cathedral could take care of. If all of the dignitaries came as expected, and most of the members of the Senate and the House, they weren't going to have enough seats. But then on the other hand, these invitations went to a lot of people who they were quite certain would not come today, such as some of the general's classmates who are also 78 and can't make it here. One of the notables who will not make it is the former President Truman, one of the two surviving former presidents of the United States. And Mrs. Truman called Mrs. Eisenhower today and said how sorry her husband was he couldn't come up from Key West, where he is resting, vacationing, but he couldn't make it. We see now from the rotunda the removal of the casket as they pallbearers prepare to move out of the rotunda and down the steps. Roger?
The cars now here at the east front are standing four abreast in front of the great steps of the rotunda, and the family and And the official mourning party is now in position to the left of the steps as you approach it from the east. The hearse is in place and has been here just at the center of the plaza at the base of the steps for the last 2 hours. This will not be a military procession as such. It will be by a motorized hearse from the funeral home that has handled the details of this funeral. And now, by a quick and very rough count, perhaps 30 cars, many of them rented limousines, others official government, and so far all of them in black. Yesterday, in the scurrying arrangements here, there were some representatives of foreign governments who came in apparently the private cars of the second and third ranking embassy men, and they were pastels and greens, and regular civilian cars. Today they're all the familiar funereal black. President Nixon is due here at the Capitol in just within a minute or two. Yesterday the mourners were at the base of the stairs waiting for the casket. Casket is now being lifted off of the catafalque, which has served here in the Capitol for over 100 years. This is the honor guard that has watched over the casket since it was brought here yesterday. There's President Nixon's car approaching Capitol Hill. And he will be here in a matter of a moment or two. In fact, the motorcycle escort is now turning into the east front of the plaza. Plaza of the Capitol, rather. Car now passing the Senate steps into the shade of the rotunda. And the old guard comes to a salute and takes the salute down and then comes up again with a salute. Mrs. Nixon and Tricia and the President now take their place in line with the mourners. Major John Eisenhower and his wife have just stopped here, followed by Mrs. Dwight Eisenhower. The casket is now off the catafalque and is in the hands of the pallbearers, who in a moment or two will come out of the rotunda. Mrs. Eisenhower is now standing on the arm of, holding to the arm of her son. On the front line, President Nixon has dropped back a rank or two to make way for her. on the outside. The pallbearers have just emerged onto the top step of the great expanse of marble that rises from the plaza. Mrs. Eisenhower herself has stepped just a little out of line, so she is able to watch the procession as it comes down the stairs. The others of the mourners stand looking almost straight ahead. Coast Guard band. Eisenhower is now being escorted back to her limousine by son John. During that entire movement from the rotunda to the plaza, she never once took her eyes off the casket. President Nixon stood at almost military attention with his right hand over his heart. During that dirge that we just heard played, we had a momentary scare here when Rufus Youngblood, one of the Secret Service men, spotted up on the highest balustrade of the rotunda itself the figure of a man, and it was quickly determined by use of walkie-talkie that a photographer somehow had gotten through and was taking pictures from up above.
Roger, regarding Milton Eisenhower, who we reported a little earlier had been taken to Walter Reed Hospital this afternoon, the hospital says it has no immediate word on his illness still, that he had been admitted for medical observation. Friends said they believed he was simply fatigued, that he'd been going pretty hard the last few days since the death of his older brother on Friday, and the hospital promises us some word on his condition in another 20 minutes.
The procession here at the Capitol is momentarily to leave the plaza and start down the Constitution and into Virginia Avenue and up through Rock Creek Park into Massachusetts. Cars are all ready, motors running, and only waiting from a signal which has just been given. And now the police escort slowly pulls out of the plaza. Each of these cars has not only a military driver, but a military escort officer.
How you doing, Rod?
Now the hearse is leaving, followed by the Eisenhower car bearing Pennsylvania plate OVO 000. That plate was replaced just the other day, replacing the old plates DDE. Procession will not move, of course, as slowly as it did yesterday, but at a pace of about 20 to 25 miles an hour. Now the president's car has passed the center line of the plaza, Mrs. Nixon, Tricia, and the president, followed by two Secret Service cars and the president's military attaché. Very quickly, just to sum up here, Walter, very quickly the crowd has already turned and is beginning to break up and find warmer spots for the afternoon.
Roger, Mrs. Eisenhower looks as if she's bearing up quite well. She's always looked younger than her 72 years, but she seems to be really bearing up quite well.
Well, there was an almost a deliberate movement on her part. She, as you could see on your picture, Walter, she was at the in the front line at the end, occupying the first corner, and as the casket came out of the rotunda, she did a half left face, and which brought her out of the line a little bit, so she was able to follow the progress of the pallbearers right down the line. And as the casket came by her, she faced forward, and as it passed her, then she faced half right, so that it was some courage and some determination that would permit her to do that. So the procession is left here, Walter. This is Roger Mudd at the Capitol.
Roger. This is Eisenhower's brother-in-law. Edgar Eisenhower is a Tacoma, Washington lawyer. Said after a short visit with her this morning that she'd suffered a bigger shock than she expected, even though she had a long time to plan for it. But she certainly does seem to be bearing up very well and most graciously. And there is Vice President Spiro Agnew coming into the National Cathedral, where Dan Rather is present. Dan?
The inside of the cathedral, which will seat about 1,500 people, begins to fill out. Outside, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey has just moved inside. General Charles de Gaulle at the right of your screen. Mr. Bourguiba, just to his right. Shah of Iran, also on his right. This is a long shot from the back of the great cathedral hall. The hall bears plaques to the memories of George Washington, Lee. The body of Admiral Dewey, the hero of Manila Bay, is entombed just below this great hall. This shot is from the front of the cathedral hall. On the main floor of the cathedral, stretching back to the temporary west wall, are rows of bays on both sides of the nave. I believe that is Postmaster General Blunt, just now arriving, escorted by a representative of the United States Marine Corps to a seat near that of former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who is seated with his wife Muriel. Secret Service men interspersed on every row inside the cathedral.
Dan, that's quite a shot there with Vice President Key, South Vietnam, and Mrs. Key right in front of former Vice President Hubert Humphrey.
Yes, Walter, and this shot is the outside of the cathedral. Gives you a very good idea of that marvelous architecture we've been talking about through the weekend. That's a high shot from the area in which the dignitaries arrive. Not everyone invited to the funeral services here at the National Cathedral arrives by limousine. We've seen our share of taxi cabs pull up. One invited guest got off a city bus a few minutes ago. The United States Marine Band, which marched up about 15 minutes ago to a muted drum, stands ready to play. There'll be the ruffles and flourishes, hail to the chief, among the other selections here this afternoon. A mighty fortress is our Lord, Onward Christian Soldiers, and Army Blue. Outside the cathedral, the crowd has grown to what I would now estimate to be in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 10,000 people. The crowd is muted and mannered, many of them busy taking photographs, figuring that this is perhaps their chance of a lifetime to personally photograph someone as famous as Charles de Gaulle or Lord Mountbatten or Prime Minister Gordon of Australia. To put you on location here, for those of you who don't know Washington, Woodley Street is just in front of this north entrance to the cathedral. That house across the way is the leased home of Senator Eugene McCarthy, formerly the home of syndicated columnist Walter Lippmann. Some of the crowd of 8,000 to 10,000 standing on Senator McCarthy's front lawn. Woodley Street, which is about, at this juncture, 1 block off of Wisconsin, one of the main thoroughfares of northwest Washington, is the entrance for nearly all of the dignitaries. The funeral cortege, we're told, will enter from the rear of the cathedral, but of course for security reasons, Not many details are being given on exact entrances and exits, and not many are wanted, frankly, for those same security reasons. Perhaps you can see in the crowd here and there a buddy posting his buddy up on his shoulders, House Speaker McCormick, inside the cathedral. He was one of the early arrivals, House Speaker McCormick. Former President and Mrs. Lyndon Johnson, I believe, are now arriving. We can see only the rear, but it has that inimitable walk of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Vice President Spiro Agnew inside the hall. Outside the cathedral, I'm almost certain that former President Johnson just walked in.
Yes, I think, Dan, on a close, long lens with the television camera, we could pretty well identify him as the president.
President Johnson did not make known his leave time from Texas or his arrival time in Washington. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, former President and First Lady, arriving inside the cathedral, which President Johnson knows well. Both of his daughters attended school at the National Cathedral School. Both graduated, both Linda and Lucy, from here. Mrs. Johnson paid a personal half-hour visit to the widow, Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower, over the weekend. Mrs. Johnson was in Washington on a personal visit at or about the time of President Eisenhower's death. President Johnson stopping to say hello to Vice President Agnew and others in this crowd of dignitaries, most of whom he knows on a first-name basis. Today, ironically perhaps, the anniversary of the day in 1968 when President Johnson announced that he would not seek nor accept another term in the presidency. This was the date, March 31st, of his speech, which eventually led to a total bombing halt over North Vietnam and the beginning of the Paris peace talks.
Dan, we have a little more word on Dr. Milton Eisenhower from George Wills, the information director over in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University, who says that Dr. Eisenhower was admitted to Walter Reed Medical Center purely as a precautionary measure because of the strain of events of this past week. He is resting comfortably at Walter Reed. He did not collapse. His hospitalization is purely precautionary. That's the statement from Mr. Wills. We're also told that he was conscious and had asked to go to the hospital when he felt a little ill at the Eisenhower suite at the hotel. And we're still waiting for further word from the hospital, although as they're conducting tests, they say they do not believe that Dr. Milton Eisenhower will be able to accompany the rest of the family on the train this afternoon to Abilene.
Well, certainly good news for those friends and admirers of Dr. Milton Eisenhower, who, of course, has had a remarkable career in public service himself, author of an excellent book on Latin America called The Wine is Bitter, president of several universities.
It was certainly a tower of strength to the president, President Eisenhower, during his 8 years in the White House. He was his, of course, very closest friend as his brother and a very, very important advisor to him.
Walter, perhaps as the funeral cortege, I believe, nears the Washington Cathedral grounds, and as we look over the interior of the cathedral where the special invited guests are seated and are filling out the main hall, we can describe for our viewers what the service will be. Outside, of course, the United States Marine Band will furnish the music for both the arrival and departure. The funeral is being conducted by the Reverend Edward L.R. Elson, who is minister of the National Presbyterian Church here in Washington. The Reverend Mr. Elson baptized General Eisenhower and has been the Eisenhower family minister for years. We've said before, during this weekend of funeral coverage, that the Reverend Mr. Elson baptized General Eisenhower after he became president. That is, he baptized him into the Presbyterian faith. General Eisenhower had attended church and gone to Sunday school for many years in Abilene and at West Point, but not as a member of the Presbyterian faith. Here this afternoon, during the services, the Reverend Mr. Elson will be assisted by the very Reverend Francis B. Sayre, Jr., Dean Sayre, Dean of the Washington National Cathedral, grandson of President Woodrow Wilson. Also, the Right Reverend William F. Creighton, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, will conclude the service. The order of service, we're told, would be the same that would characterize most Christian denominations, and the order of service to be used today may be found in the Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church, that Book of Common Prayer which dates from the 16th century. It consists of an opening sentences from the Bible and Psalms, followed by scripture reading, prayers, benediction. The music is fitted in between the spoken parts of the service. The Psalms follow the opening sentences because the procession is sometimes long and the Psalms can be read responsibly until all have taken their place inside the church. The hymns and anthems were chosen, as I think you pointed out, Walter, by the Eisenhower family, most of them by the general himself, well before his death. Dr. Paul Calloway, the organist and choirmaster of the cathedral, aided in the selection of the music.
Dan, isn't it so that Dean Sayre was the last child born in the White House?
Walter, I believe that is correct. I was just going through, trying to go through a sort of a mental index card file. I believe it's true that he was the last child born in the White House.
His father was a childhood friend of the Eisenhowers in a sense. I mean, he was a child when the Eisenhowers were young Army people out in the Philippines, where Dean Sayre's father was the High Commissioner to the Philippines.
I didn't know that his father was the High Commissioner to the Philippines. Of course,
Francis B. Sayre, yeah.
General Eisenhower frequently said and told you in those interviews that in terms of making of himself the kind of military man he wanted to be, his experience in the Philippine Islands was primarily responsible.
He was aide to General MacArthur out there, which was an interesting footnote to history, too. Dan, we're going to pause just a moment now for station identification. And, Dan, the station identifications having been taken care of as far as we know, back to you.
Walter, as you can see, the choir of the National Cathedral is moving into place underneath the 350-foot cathedral tower. Outside, the crowd continues to strain and look, hoping to catch a glimpse of some dignitary, possibly a late arrival. Although, as we've been spot checking on the list, I believe all of the foreign heads of state and representatives of foreign governments who were invited are in their places.
I don't suppose, Dan, that there has been any such gathering of world dignitaries since the funeral here in Washington of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963. I can't, off the top of my head, think of any international event that has brought so many of the world's leaders together.
Possibly the death of Winston Churchill, but that, of course,
that's
in
right.
London, not here. But the Churchill funeral, the only one since the John Kennedy funeral that I believe would have been the occasion for so
You're
many
right.
heads of state.
You're right. That was after Kennedy. I was thinking it was the other way around, but you're right.
Senator Goodell of New York and Mrs. Goodell, former congressman, recently appointed a senator to take the place of the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Walter, if we may, perhaps as we await the funeral cortege, and I hear some motorcycles in the background, it may be arriving momentarily, we could continue to prepare the audience for what the order of service will be. The Dean of the Cathedral, Dean Sayre, will read the opening sentences, and the Bishop of Washington will give the final benediction. All the rest of the service will be performed by the Reverend Mr. Elson of the Presbyterian Church. After the scripture readings are completed, the cathedral choir of men and boys will sing the 23rd Psalm to the music of the... I thought that we heard enough automobiles in the background to indicate that the cortege had arrived, but apparently not so. There was a little stir in the crowd here. During the service, whenever President Eisenhower's name is mentioned, he will be called Dwight David, the Christian names given to him at baptism. This is inside the cathedral, Speaker McCormick in the middle of the screen.
I think that's...
Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, pardon me, Walter, just at the lower right-hand edge of the screen.
I was going to say that's Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, I believe, sitting right next to Speaker McCormick. He was a very close friend of General Eisenhower's.
Walter, I heard it said or read somewhere today that one of the reasons that President de Gaulle of France said unhesitatingly when he heard of General Eisenhower's death, "I'll be there," was because both he and the French people, in addition to, of course, never forgetting the great Allied force which liberated France from Nazi Germany during the war, that General Eisenhower was the man who made the decision that General de Gaulle and French troops would be the first to enter Paris, and as the Allies retook Paris from the Germans.
Yes, I think that's quite so. And of course, General Eisenhower also supported de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French forces in England during the time when France was fully occupied before D-Day, when there was some strain within the Free French forces as to who would actually be the leader of those forces. This was always somewhat bitter gall for Mr. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, because he did not feel that de Gaulle in later years was as appreciative as he might have been of all that was done for him by the Allied command, and General Eisenhower particularly.
Walter, seeing this shot of Vice President Hubert Humphrey reminds me that both Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson appear to have lost considerable weight. I know that President Johnson has lost about 15 pounds since he left the presidency, and judging from that shot, I would say that Vice President Humphrey probably has lost at least 5.
Dan, we have a further word from Walter Reed Hospital now. In a negative sense, we have word from Walter Reed Hospital. They say they will not have a statement now on Milton Eisenhower today, but that he probably will stay at the hospital overnight for observation. They may have a statement tomorrow. So it doesn't sound as if his condition is serious, certainly, if they're only saying that he probably will stay overnight. And that's hopeful. Milton Eisenhower, the 68-year-old younger of the 2 surviving brothers of General Eisenhower. The other is 80-year-old Edgar Eisenhower, the Tacoma banker. And if you tuned in late, Milton Eisenhower went to the hospital to Walter Reed at 3:30 this afternoon, feeling fatigued and a little ill, and he's under observation there and apparently will not accompany the funeral train now to Abilene later today.
Walter, the hearse is arriving at the entrance to the National Cathedral. In a moment, the United States Marine Corps Band will play 4 ruffles and flourishes, then the Song of Presidents, Hail to the Chief, then the Martin Luther hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. A hush falls over the crowd. Some of the stragglers, some of the latecomers, trotting up to the rear of the crowd, which stands 12 deep where we are, just in front of the cathedral. All straining for a look. You can see just the edges of the crowd at the top of your screen. However, most of the crowd is being kept back a distance of minimum 50 yards.